We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to eradicating human slavery, human trafficking, child exploitation, and child sexual abuse material through disrupting networks and applying data, technology, and advanced analytics and intelligence.
Welcome, everyone. This is the Follow the Money, Fight Slavery 2023 Summit panel titled AML Leadership Take on the Regulatory View on Human Trafficking in Child Sexual Abuse Material. I'm Sarah Byrne, the panel moderator. I'll introduce myself and then I will ask each of our panelists to do the same. I'm an attorney with Moore&VanAllen in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I lead the program through which we provide comprehensive legal and financial inclusion services to survivors of human trafficking. And we recently expanded our survivors' rights practice to include child sexual abuse material space. I also work with financial institutions on anti-trafficking and survivor support programs. I'll now ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll start with Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen Arrabal. I'm the Director of Financial Crimes Investigations for Fifth Third Bank. I lead a team who does our anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, human trafficking investigations of bank activity. And I've been involved in several initiatives where the bank has partnered with nonprofits to do deep dives into transactional analysis around identifying human trafficking and child sexual exploitation material within our customer base.
Excellent. How about Will?
Kind of a similar background there. Hi, Will Voorhees. I am currently the manager of our enterprise fraud group here at Truist Financial. I've been doing that the past few months. Prior to that, here at Truist, I managed our anti-money laundering and in a lot of the financial crimes area around SAR filings and investigations. We've also built a number of anti-trafficking initiatives here and programs here at Truist that I'm sure we're going to be getting into in this presentation. So just happy to be here with all of you.
Thank you, Will. Jim, how about you?
Thanks, Sarah. Happy to be here. Jim Richards. I have been involved in anti-financial crime matters since the 1980s. So that's how old I am. I was a BSA officer and head of financial crimes at a very, very large U.S. financial institution for about 15 years. And for the last 5 years, I've been on my own doing some consulting work in the financial crime space.
Welcome. Carol?
Hi, everyone. I'm pleased to be here today. I'm Carol Beaumier. I have a long career in financial services, including as a former regulator. I'm currently a senior managing director with Protiviti, a global risk consulting firm. Similar to Jim, I've spent probably the last 25 years working in financial crime in the US, Europe, APAC, and Latin America. I'm also an advisory board member of ATII and very passionate about the work that ATII and others are doing to combat human trafficking.
Thank you. And last but not least, Wren.
Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Wren York. I have been in anti-financial crimes since 2000-ish. I've been a consultant, I've been an auditor, examiner, chief risk and compliance officer, and currently the chief operating officer at ATII. I'm also on the advisory council with Carol. And for those who aren't familiar with ATII, it's a nonprofit organization that combats global human trafficking by promoting CSR, or corporate social responsibility, which we'll discuss to some extent, through increasing awareness, facilitating intelligence integration and technology advancement, and encouraging strategic data collaboration. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. Seems like we have about a century of experience in this space. So I'm excited for this discussion. So before we dive into the panel discussion, we had talked about the importance of providing just very basic definitions of the crimes that we're going to be discussing. So I'm going to do that first. Human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or to induce commercial sex. Notably, the element of force, fraud, or coercion is not required for sex trafficking of minors. Human smuggling and human trafficking are often conflated. Human smuggling is the illegal entry of a person into the United States facilitated by another person or an organization. Child sexual exploitation is a broad term that encompasses all forms of child sexual exploitation, including child sexual abuse material, child sex trafficking, and sextortion. Sextortion is when someone threatens to distribute nude or explicit images if the victim does not provide more images, sex acts, or money. Child sexual abuse material, which we refer to as CSAM, and it's in the title of this panel, is any visual depiction of sexually explicit conduct involving a minor. Not only do these images and videos document a victim's hands-on abuse, but the victims suffer re-victimization every time those images are shared and viewed across the internet. Child sexual exploitation material, which we'll refer to as CSAM, includes self-generated images or videos that are the result of online grooming or sextortion. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reports that between 2019 and 2021, the number of sextortion reports more than doubled, and that 79% of reports involved an offender seeking money from the child. Note that these definitions of these crimes are also provided in FinCEN's various advisories on human trafficking and online sexual exploitation crimes. So with that, let's get started. And we are going to start from an organization perspective with human trafficking and then get into CSAM and CSAM. So Jim, I'm going to start with you. So the topic of this panel is about the view of regulators on these various crimes that we just defined. Can you talk to us a little bit about the national priorities that were set in 2021 and their inclusion of human trafficking and human smuggling and where that's left us today?
Sure, Sarah, thank you. So these national priorities, and we talk about 8 of them, and then human trafficking and human smuggling are one of the 8. And we'll get into that in a minute. But the national priorities were set out in the AML Act of 2020. And section 6101 of the Act. And it's important to understand the title of that Act because it talks about the intent of these priorities. The title of 6101 is Establishment of National Exam and Supervision Priorities. So this was not, the establishment of law enforcement priorities. This is exam and supervision priorities. So that's where the regulatory piece comes in. And what these priorities had to be, at the very least, was consistent with the 2018 and 2020 National Strategy for Combating Terrorist and Other Illicit Financing. So they had to be consistent. So there's no real surprises when they came out, and they included corruption, cybercrime, fraud, etc. But it also included human trafficking and human smuggling as one of the 8 priorities. And you mentioned that they're often conflated, but they're quite different. From a regulatory perspective, though, Sarah, that the Act required FinCEN to ensure that these priorities were published within 180 days of the Act being passed, which was June 30th of 2021. And they were. It was the exact date they came out. But then the Act also said that FinCEN had to come up with the regulations that would direct the regulators on how financial institutions were to incorporate those priorities into their programs. And those regulations had to be done by December 30th of 2021. We don't have them yet. So we're about, I think I can do that math in my head, 16 months late for a final rule. We don't have a proposed rule, let alone an advance notice of a proposed rule yet. So FinCEN's falling a little bit behind on that.
Thank you. So Carol, naturally I have to take this discussion to you as a former regulator. What's your take on the delay or the lack of detail around what banks can expect in human trafficking detection and their obligations?
So the short answer, especially given Jim's comment that there were no surprises here, is that it's baffling to me that we've waited this long for the rule telling institutions how to incorporate this into their programs. I mean, it leads me to believe at this point that, kind of putting aside resource limitations that we all know FinCEN has, there's something else going on at this point, maybe some philosophical difference among the principals that would cause a delay for this long. I do think it's important to remember, though, that when the priorities themselves were published, the regulators also released a press release that said, this doesn't at this point represent a fundamental change in AML compliance needs, but we would encourage you to start thinking about these priorities. So our advice to our clients has been they should start thinking about them. I think, or I would expect that there are some obvious places where these are going to be important in the future: risk assessment, potential changes to KYC, certainly transaction monitoring. And I think it's worth institutions kind of going through at least a preliminary exercise to start thinking about potential impact.
Thank you. So let's take it to the organization. Will, I'm going to throw this to you. Pending any further guidance or regulatory obligations beyond BSA and AML, what we have now, tell us what your organization has engaged in from a public-private partnership perspective to enhance the detection of human trafficking.
Well, I think we're always, trying to look out for what's the right thing to do. I think people get into anti-financial crimes, anti-money laundering, fraud work, that kind of thing at financial institutions because they want to do the right thing. They want to be able to give back, and they want to be part of the solution. And so, we have looked for a number of different ways to get involved, and we've had specialized training. We've had, folks come in and give us additional training. We've put together sort of SWAT team type of formations of groups so that we could go after specific areas of financial crimes, and trafficking being one is, one that we went after very directly. We looked for partnership opportunities outside of our organization with NGOs and law enforcement that could that we could be part of to help bring some of that financial intelligence to those groups in sort of a near real-time review of activity, looking for certain typologies and triggers and alerts and things like that we could bring to law enforcement right away that would be actionable. One of the things that is probably one of the biggest initiatives that we've been involved in is around large sporting events. I'm not going to name the actual sporting event, but let's just say it's one of those brown oblong balls that get thrown around, and it's the pinnacle of that sport. So law enforcement, other NGOs, and other financial institutions getting together, looking for trafficking activity, specifically around sexual exploitation and trafficking in those locales where those big events are taking place, and the ability to be able to look for immediately quick turnaround on things like phone numbers or addresses or other kinds of indicators, email addresses and things like that we can look for in our systems and pull activity that might be indicative of trafficking or exploitation, and get those right into the hands of law enforcement right around the same time where we know there's going to be an influx of activity around certain events. And so there's been a lot of activity year over year over the last 5 or 6 years with financial institutions, law enforcement, NGOs, and I think it's had some real positive effect.
Excellent.
That was a super comment, Will. You bowled me over.
Exactly.
Funny guys. So what I'm hearing is internal training, your organization's involved in that, but also just really strong partnerships with law enforcement, NGOs, and other financial institutions in information sharing, perhaps around events that might help all the groups better target trafficking.
That's
so on that topic of public-private partnerships, Wren, can you tell us a little bit about ATII's Project Hades?
I will. Before I do that, I just want to play off of Jim, Carol, and Will very quickly to their point about the timing of the materials, the intent, where FinCEN is, et cetera. The U.S. frequently lags other entities that are pushing regulatory requirements and expectations. In particular, the FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force, is a really good example. an example of the U.S. lagging in staying in step with international efforts. The CDD rule is one example, but human trafficking is another one. So to the extent that we've talked about the national priorities to the audience, I would encourage you to read some FATF literature. There was a document in summer of 2018 about the financial flows of human trafficking, still relevant, and it speaks to what Will, Carolyn, and Jim were saying in terms of looking at typologies, red flags, transactional activity. If you're a financial institution, you know that your regulatory burden is to be able to identify something that has the appearance of being unusual or suspicious, and then you report it. In terms of Project Hades, it's one of the many projects at ATII that we work with. And again, this is off of what Will was just talking about. We collaborate with law enforcement, NGOs, for-profits, financial institutions, third-party service providers, by providing a type of data that can be ingested into their risk management programs and help to identify those typologies. And then you bounce that off your clientele portfolio and you start to look at things through, you know, is there a connection here, or is this consistent with what appears to be smuggling or trafficking? And then you meet that regulatory burden by filing accordingly. Outside of Project Hades, we also work with colleges and universities. We do some internships, which helps because after those students graduate and they move on, they stay connected to the efforts of anti-human trafficking. We also do OSINT, or open source intelligence training for the public. We did that in January. It was a huge success. There's a huge demand for it. So we're going to do that again, probably June or July. But these are efforts to identify information that's both open source. Hades is both open source and on the dark web. There's a methodology to identifying certain information where even if we're working with entities that are pseudonyms, we're starting to collect the data and make connections. And then sometimes you can make a connection. This is just one example and I'll get off of it. You can look at photos from the internet and see the same girl across certain regions, or the same victim, I'll say, across certain regions or in certain advertisements. And then you start to connect these dots and say, okay, this is that bread trail, if you will. So it's very informative. We're working with the, I forget the name of the entity in Australia, and I apologize to them. But we also work with FinCEN and local authorities on getting information that they've asked us to produce, to go out and see if it exists and then produce it and then have those conversations.
All right, so let's shift away from trafficking for a moment and talk about CSAM and CSAM. Karen, I'm going to put you on the spot, and will you tell us, I've heard you speak about this in other contexts and just find your remarks really useful. Can you tell us about your work in this space and perhaps provide some real world context?
Yeah, so our bank recently partnered with The Noble, which is a nonprofit organization that focuses on stopping human crime. And it was a project specifically targeted towards identifying CSAM activity within our four walls and our customer base. And I got involved with it kind of on the peripheral and was starting to get engaged and involved with it. And it really hit home just a couple months into the project when one of my daughter's classmates filed a lawsuit against the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, her school, and their principal, because during COVID, their daughter had been targeted on the computer software through all the filters that were designed to protect children from being able to access inappropriate sites or have chat functions and send pictures, receive pictures. Their child had been targeted and was groomed by more than 10 offenders while everyone was at home doing remote learning. And so to really see it hit that close to home and recognize that if this activity is happening in suburban Cincinnati, it's happening everywhere. And so drawing those two connections between what's happening in the real world and what's happening in my professional life and bringing those two experiences together was really meaningful and important. And as my team got into the project and learned more about the red flags and the typologies, people found this work really engaging and they really felt very, very fulfilled, because so many times AML folks, we have a very regulatory focused job where we're making sure we're meeting timelines, and we're making sure that we have certain excerpts and our narratives in our reporting are phrased a very certain way. And here was something where we were actually having an impact on something happening in our communities, in our customer base, and we were able to engage pretty closely with law enforcement throughout the process to make sure that the work we were doing was meaningful and beneficial, and what was helping aid their investigations as they worked through what we completed and referred to them.
So similar to around Alon Blal, was there any kind of anchor event or series of events that you targeted for this project, that you were specifically targeting CSAM and CSAM with law enforcement?
Yeah, so we partnered with a couple of private sector organizations to identify very specific typologies and red flags, and search within our customer transactional activity to find that. And we were able to take some of the engagement that we learned and some of the partnership with the NOAA and Project Shadow out of Canada, and understand better what we are specifically looking for and what we need to have when we are analyzing customer accounts, customer activity, for both red flags of being a suspect and being a victim as well. And so we were able to actually train our entire financial crimes organization with the results of our our project work that came out of it. And that was really important and significant, because we were seeing that people across our organization were identifying this activity and identifying the red flags because they had that training. And one of the tricky things about identifying CSAM activity in transactional accounts is it's not all that different from your typical client base. And so I always kind of say, okay, how are you going to tell the difference between the suburban mom who has, like myself, who has young kids who play travel sports, and we travel a lot, and we rent hotel rooms, and we eat out a lot, and we have hair and nail appointments, and we spend a lot of money on Roblox and Fortnite, right? Like, there's so many things that we do as typical and normal parents, but how do we differentiate between that and offenders and those who are looking to target and exploit children? And so that was a big learning curve for our group.
So that's really encouraging to hear that initiatives like that have been able to identify typologies and red flags to share with the community. So Carol, I've got to come back to you now. What do you think is needed by regulators to improve financial institution detection of CSAM and or CSAM specifically? We've gotten a fair amount of guidance on human trafficking and perhaps human smuggling, over the last decade or so, but what would make this easier from a regulatory perspective?
I think Will touched on this and actually in his response, and I think it starts with training. And I would say that training needs to include the regulators, not just the financial institutions. And I'm not saying that to be critical. I think that's just the reality that this will be new space for a lot of people, and the more training that they can get to understand what they should be looking for, the better. I do think, to the point Karen made, there has been a lot of good work done by a number of different organizations, financial institutions, that has resulted in identifying typologies. And the more those typologies can be shared with institutions, particularly smaller institutions that are likely to struggle more in trying to put together an effective program, I think that can only be helpful as well. And I think basically just arming people with as much information as possible to kind of kickstart their efforts.
Mm-hmm. So, Will, let's take a step back out of the AML regulatory space. What do you think banks can do more of to combat all of these crimes? Trafficking, CSAM, CSAM.
I think they have to focus on it. I think we're gonna say training again, because it really is where it all starts. And it's not just training for the investigative teams to look at transactions. It's training in that front line. training those branch operations folks to recognize what it looks like when somebody comes in and opens an account and they're doing it on behalf of somebody else, or they're doing it under duress, and how does that appear? And then also, we're not only talking about trafficking for sexual exploitation. We're talking about trafficking for working as well. And so when we talk about folks that are either cashing checks, or they're taking out cash, or they're having people open accounts and for some kind of domestic work, those kinds of things are important for our branches to be able to look for red flags and then have a way to refer that in properly with good information, so that the folks who should be the most trained in how to investigate and report it have good information from the front line, so that they can take it on and take it to law enforcement and get some action on it. Because at the end of the day, if all we're doing is reviewing transactions and filing SARs, we're not doing enough, right? We can get it into the hands of law enforcement at the time when it's critical, and when they can actually maybe take some action to catch it and help a victim before that victim gets moved, somewhere else. And then we haven't talked about, Sarah, how do you also help and support victims in this? And one of the things I know that we're doing a lot of work on is how can we support victims after they have come out of the life, so that they're not victimized again, right? How do we help them stand up on their own 2 feet so they don't fall back into being susceptible to what maybe brought them in the first place? So I think there's a lot we can do if we look at the problem holistically from end to end, and we tackle it with good training and education around. And there's so many wonderful NGOs and firms out there that will come in and help. And I think law enforcement needs more training. Carol talked about the regulators need more training, and the regulators need the training not so they can come down and deliver with a big stick on the institutions, but so that they can help partner with the institutions too, and bring some of that knowledge and help to those smaller institutions that we've talked about. The BSA officer is also filing CTRs, and probably is also the CRA officer as well, and like a lot of other regulatory things, has a team of 3 people and is trying to handle everything together. So it can't just be another additive thing. It has to be something that is part of our kind of core values and mission for organizations.
So well said, Will. And I can't resist when you talk about other creative ways that financial institutions can support survivors during recovery. I must talk about the Survivor Inclusion Initiative, which I think everybody on the call is aware of, which comes out of the United Nations Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking Initiative, which is a program through which signatory banks offer banking products and services to survivors of trafficking without the usual barriers that they might otherwise face in accessing safe banking. It's a wonderful program that's been around for a number of years now and is just continuing to grow and provide service. I have a number of clients who have accessed banking products and services through that program. So that's just one of the examples that you mentioned of partnerships and, again, supporting survivors at that time.
That's right.
So Jim, I'm gonna guess that you have some other ideas for what banks can do.
Well, I'm going to sort of add to what Will mentioned around the sort of the training and awareness, particularly on the behavioral indicators. And FinCEN has put out, I think it's a couple of advisories on human trafficking over the last few years. One was in 2014, but one was in 2020. It was October-ish of 2020. And in it, they laid out a whole bunch of financial indicators or red flags, but also those behavioral indicators. And that was for the frontline, primarily branch people. And they were really good. And so it's so important to really engage with your branch people who are not only in a branch, but they're out in the community. and really see what's going on. And that's sort of a real prevention piece. But I think there's a real difference between what a bank wants to do, to do the right thing when it comes to combating human trafficking, for example, and what it can do. And my only concern is what banks can do is dependent in large part on not only what resources they have available to them, but their relationship with their regulators. And again, Will mentioned this. Are they getting jammed up for crossing T's and dotting I's and, yada, yada? Or do they have the ability and the regulatory freedom to go out and do this sort of important proactive work? So we need that partnership with the regulators. And this is particularly important, I think, because, and here's sort of a bit of a stat that I'll throw out at everybody. Roughly 3/4 of all the banks in the US have fewer than 100 employees. So that's 3,700-ish banks that have fewer than 100 employees. And a lot of them have 20, 25, 30 employees. So they don't have the team that Karen has, or the team that Will has, or the ability to pour through 35 pages on the national priorities. So I think we just need to really focus, and I know you guys do a wonderful job that way, but really focus on the smallest institutions, because I think that's where a lot of difference can be made, because they're so close to their rural communities and things like that, where a lot of this human trafficking activity occurs.
That's a great point, and perhaps they can have even more intimate contact with law enforcement NGOs in those areas, so they could have even greater impact. So Wren, you have written creatively about incentives for financial institutions to better respond to human trafficking, CSAM, and CSAM. Will you share some of those ideas, again, beyond regulatory compliance measures?
Sure, thank you. So it follows the same line of what Will and Jim were just speaking about in the examples that Karen mentioned. So you've got the ESG, or the environmental social governance. This is the big topic of current times. And within that is the CSR, which we mentioned earlier in the discussion, which is your corporate social responsibility. So staying in that swim lane, you can make many arguments of, what is important to an institution in terms of their corporate social responsibility. And that ties into who are they doing business with? Where are they located, in terms of their footprint? What are their complexities? What are their products and services? You have to look at these banks individually. Jim makes a valid point. Lots of banks in the US, as an example, many of them are understaffed or have limited staff. What your good regulators are looking for, and Carol, back me up, keep me honest, is your culture of compliance. What efforts are you making? For folks who say, well, we've got 20 people and we don't have the money for that. A lot of this information could be available to you for free, depending on your situation. There's the OSC, which is the Office for Survivors of Crimes, and they put out CBTs, or computer-based training, for free on what red flags and pathologies are on human trafficking. And they're one source. There's many out there. The network of anti-human trafficking is gigantic, and it's perplexing to me because watching it grow over the years, there's this disconnect that you can't reconcile with. We've got far more actors, but the crime continues to grow at a rocket rate. It's that hockey puck thing. But going back to the culture of compliance, you have to ask yourself, if you're going to be serious about CSR, and particularly if you're a publicly traded entity and you're going to be subject to investors who care about that, what's your priority? If you're an institution that you're trying to push all the states to be pro-marijuana related businesses, regardless if it's medicinal or recreational, is that really where you want to put your emphasis? With the porous borders currently right now, it's imperative for banks to look internally and say, are we in a hotspot? Does human trafficking exist in our footprint? Okay, what are we doing about it? To our audience, we've got programs through FinCEN and DOJ on high intensity drug trafficking areas. That's something that DOJ keeps track of at the city level and the zip code level. FinCEN does a very similar thing with high intensity financial crimes areas, or HIFCA. So even though there isn't a high intensity human trafficking area at this time, but fingers crossed, it's the same practice of looking at when you're onboarding a client, if you're a financial institution. What are you doing to look at this client and say, oh, you know what, they're in this zip code? It may not be human trafficking. They may not be drug trafficking. They may not be financial crimes, but that's incumbent on you to do that vetting and saying with meeting that reasonable bar. But there's so many ways of showing culture of compliance. If you want to get your staff certified, there are universities that are offering programs. You've got associations that are offering programs like ACAMS and ABA. There's another one by McAfee, but it's more law enforcement intense. So I would, for financial institutions, I would steer them in a slightly different direction. But I'd also encourage banks, and I have had these conversations with regional banks in particular, because to the earlier point made, some of the smaller banks, all banks I think want to do well. But the smaller banks, they really do want to do the right thing, but they don't have the resources the larger banks have. And I've got even new pressures this year, which we won't get into, but everyone knows what that's about. But start thinking about what exists and how can you expand the utility of it. Think about, if you're a financial institution, think about the Community Reinvestment Act or the CRA. You're subject to a CRA PE or a Community Reinvestment Act performance evaluation. And you can get credit for what you're doing in your community. Many banks will do things like feed the homeless, build a playground, do some sort of financial education for junior high and high school. Well, wait a minute, why not just add some information about educating folks at the junior high and high school level who tend to become victims more so than any other age group as it relates to human trafficking. And so what you're doing is, if you're already involved in your community and you're doing things that are getting you CRA credit, talk with your partners and say, hey, we'd like to, educate junior high and high school individuals so that if they see something, they say something critical, or if they see something, then they know how to steer away from it. These are really important. Jim mentioned prevention. That's all part of prevention mentality. We've talked about training. There's so many ways of training your staff so that at a minimum, you're demonstrating that you do have a culture of compliance. And then, you're going to have to do things in a way where you're taking that next step. And when you're a big bank and you could do things where you're involved with a collection of actors at major sporting events, you can do some really crazy, wonderful things. We've seen incidents where known perpetrators were at these events and they got caught. You can take them out of circulation. And that's the thing, is realizing with human trafficking, we are not going to prevent this. This is not going away, but we can disrupt it. We can take victims out and we can prevent new victims from going.
Thank you so much, Wren. That was full of tactical solutions, which is what we all want out of programs like this. I'll add one more. Financial institutions are uniquely positioned to combat trafficking for all the reasons we've talked about, but also they're lenders. So perhaps considering ESG-linked loans to their borrowers that are specifically socially linked loans to incent borrowers to engage in some program, whether it's due diligence down the supply chain or some other measure to prevent or reduce human trafficking, is a extraordinary way for banks not only to combat it themselves, but also among their customers as well. So I'll offer that. So we only have a few more minutes, and I'm going to take the risk, and I'll open this up to the whole panel and introduce a topic that could have its own day-long panel session. But what about the role of cryptocurrency or artificial intelligence in all of this? Does anybody have any words of wisdom on how these areas further complicate an already very complicated AML and fraud detection processes?
We'll start with crypto, as just, quickly movable cash on the internet. I mean, it really just is a way to transfer value across borders, across large geographies, and really kind of obscure the ownership and control and movement of the funds. I mean, I would say that it's definitely not as opaque as it was years and years ago. Our FBI and other law enforcement agencies are really, really good at tracing and getting to the bottom of it. But there's also a lot of different ways to mix and tumble these these funds and commingle them and chain hop through a bunch of different types of cryptocurrencies and then ultimately, you know, pay somebody. So the ability to be able to transfer these funds in a way that, and I would say it's not just limited to crypto. I mean, we have a lot of other person-to-person payment mechanisms now that also make it pretty easy to, at least at the street level, to be able to pay for things like, you know, images or encounters and you know, you name it, Zelle, Venmo, PayPal, those have been around for a while, Zelle being the newest on the block, but then you've got crypto too, which makes it even easier to go across borders. So so I think it just enables the criminals and the traffickers to have another vehicle for moving their funds around. And as you know, and we all know, that the earliest adopters of any new technology like AI are going to be bad guys, right? The fraudsters and the criminals jump on that stuff first before there's any type of controls put down on it. We saw a lot of that with crypto, but I think it's much easier to trace now than it was, but it still is an easy way to move those funds around.
Well, makes a really
Anybody
good
else?
point. You know, for financial institutions, they're under the regulatory yoke, but for perpetrators and with fraud evolving, they don't have any regulatory oversight, and they tend to have the latest technology. So, you know, constantly chasing them.
So with that, does any of the panelists want to offer any final comments on any of this? Trafficking, CSAM, CSAM, expectations for regulatory guidance and or enforcement?
Well, I'll throw one out. If you're in the, you know, one of the dedicated people in the financial crimes space in your financial institution, and you're just not getting the support from senior management, groups like ATII are great places to go for you to get those resources to try to convince your reluctant senior managers to get on board. Because I don't know if there's anything more important than this, frankly.
Thank you, Jim, for that. Thank all of you. This is a really esteemed panel, not just for your work in this space and the guidance you shared today, but the clear passion that you have for this very deserving victim population. So as someone who represents victims every day, it really, your work on the ground really makes such a difference. So thank you. Keep up the good work. And with that, we will close the program. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Sure.